What if I told you that the inflation crisis most Americans thought was behind them is quietly making a comeback? For a brief period, many people believed the worst was over. Headlines became less alarming, but beneath the surface, a different reality has been developing. The cost of living remains painfully high. Families are still struggling to make ends meet, and signs are emerging that inflationary pressures may be building once again. Wave of economic challenges that feels even more shock of previous years. The problem is that inflation doesn't disappear simply because it stops dominating the news cycle. It affects everything from groceries and rent to healthcare and education. Even when inflation rates slow down, prices rarely return to previous levels. Once the cost of goods rises, consumers often continue paying those higher prices indefinitely. This creates a situation where households feel trapped. Wages may increase, but not fast enough to keep up with the cumulative rise in expenses. The result is a growing sense of financial pressure that many Americans experience every day. Is that it only concerns economists and investors? In reality, inflation impacts everyone. It affects the retiree living on a fixed income. It affects the young family trying to buy their first home. Inflation acts like a hidden tax, reducing purchasing power and making it harder for people to achieve financial security. To understand why inflation may be returning, we need to examine several powerful forces shaping the economy. The first is government debt. The United States has accumulated trillions of dollars in debt over many decades. While debt itself is not necessarily dangerous, reduce spending, borrow more money, or create additional currency to manage their obligations. Historically, periods of high debt, inflationary pressures because creating money becomes one of the. Another major factor is government spending. During economic crises, governments frequently inject massive amounts of money into the economy to support businesses and households. While these measures can prevent recessions from becoming depressions, they also increase the amount of money circulating throughout the system. If the supply of goods and services does not grow at the same pace, prices tend to rise. This basic economic principle remains relevant today as policymakers continue navigating competing priorities. The labor market also plays a significant role in inflation dynamics. Many industries continue experiencing worker shortages despite technological advancements. Employers must offer higher wages to attract and retain employees, while higher wages benefit workers. They can also contribute to inflation if businesses pass increased labor costs on to consumers. Restaurants raise menu prices. Retailers increase product costs. Service providers charge more. This cycle can create a feedback loop where rising wages and rising prices reinforce each other. Housing represents another critical area of concern. For millions of Americans, housing costs consume the largest portion of monthly income. Even if overall inflation moderates, elevated housing expenses continue straining household budgets. Mortgage rates remain significantly higher than levels seen during the era of ultra-low interest rates. At the same time, housing supply remains constrained in many regions. This imbalance between supply and demand keeps upward pressure on prices and rents. Energy costs are equally important. Nearly every product in the economy depends on energy in some form. Factories require electricity. Transportation networks require fuel. Agricultural production relies on energy-intensive processes. When energy prices rise, the effects spread throughout the entire economy. Consumers may notice higher gasoline prices first, but eventually those increases appear in food prices, shipping costs, and countless other goods and services. Global tensions add another layer of uncertainty. Supply chains have become increasingly vulnerable to geopolitical conflicts, trade disputes, and regional instability. When supply chains are disrupted, shortages emerge. Shortages often lead to higher prices. Recent years demonstrated how quickly global events can affect local economies. A disruption thousands of miles away can eventually increase costs for consumers across the United States. The Federal Reserve remains at the center of the inflation debate. As America's central bank, the Federal Reserve attempts to balance economic growth with price stability. When inflation rises too quickly, the Fed typically raises interest rates. Higher interest rates make borrowing more expensive, which can reduce spending and slow inflation. However, this approach comes with trade-offs. Higher rates can weaken economic growth, reduce business investment, and increase financial stress for households carrying debt. Many Americans are already feeling the consequences of higher interest rates. Credit card balances have become more expensive to carry. Auto loans require larger monthly payments. Mortgage affordability has deteriorated dramatically. These challenges create a difficult environment where consumers face both elevated prices and higher borrowing costs. Simultaneously, this combination can feel particularly painful because it limits financial flexibility. One reason inflation feels worse today is psychological. Consumers remember what prices used to be. They compare current costs with those from just a few years ago. Even if inflation slows from a rapid pace to a moderate pace, people continue experiencing sticker shock. A grocery bill that once totaled $100 may now exceed $130 or $140. Families notice these differences every week. Over time, the cumulative effect can significantly alter household finances. The impact on the middle class deserves special attention. Wealthy households often possess assets that appreciate during inflationary periods. Stocks, real estate, and businesses can sometimes benefit from rising prices. Lower-income households may qualify for various forms of assistance. The middle class frequently occupies a difficult position between these extremes. They earn too much to qualify for substantial support yet often lack sufficient assets to fully protect themselves from inflation. Small businesses face their own set of challenges. Rising input costs force difficult decisions. Owners may increase prices, accept lower profit margins, reduce staffing levels, or postpone expansion plans. None of these options are ideal. Inflation creates uncertainty that complicates long-term planning. When businesses struggle to predict future costs, investment decisions become more cautious. Retirees may be among the most vulnerable groups. Many retirees depend on savings accumulated over decades. Inflation erodes the purchasing power of those savings. Even modest inflation can have a substantial impact over long periods. Healthcare expenses, which often rise faster than overall inflation, create additional pressure. Retirees must carefully manage resources while navigating an environment of persistent price increases. Perhaps the most concerning possibility is that inflation becomes entrenched. Temporary inflation can be managed relatively easily. Persistent inflation presents a much greater challenge. When businesses and consumers begin expecting prices to rise continuously, their behavior changes. Workers demand higher wages. Companies raise prices preemptively. Investors adjust strategies. These expectations can become self-fulfilling, making inflation harder to control. Technology offers some reasons for optimism. Advances in artificial intelligence, automation, and productivity-enhancing tools could help reduce costs over time. Increased productivity allows economies to produce more goods and services with fewer resources. Historically, productivity growth has been one of the most effective ways to improve living standards while containing inflation. However, these benefits may take years to fully materialize. Investors are closely monitoring inflation because it influences nearly every asset class. Stock valuations, bond yields, real estate prices, and commodity markets all respond to inflation expectations. Periods of uncertainty often produce increased market volatility. Investors attempt to anticipate future policy decisions and economic conditions, creating rapid shifts in market sentiment. For ordinary Americans, the practical question is simple: how can households prepare? The first step is recognizing that inflation may remain a long-term challenge rather than a temporary inconvenience. Budgeting becomes more important. Reducing high-interest debt can improve financial resilience. Building emergency savings provides flexibility during uncertain periods. Investing in skills and education may help workers maintain earning power as economic conditions evolve. Financial discipline becomes increasingly valuable during inflationary periods. Impulse spending becomes more costly. Careful planning can help families stretch resources further. While no strategy completely eliminates inflation risk, thoughtful financial management can reduce vulnerability. Small adjustments made consistently over time often produce meaningful results. History provides an important lesson. Inflation cycles tend to occur in waves rather than straight lines. There are periods of relief followed by renewed pressures. Economic conditions can change rapidly. Policymakers may achieve temporary success only to encounter new challenges later. Understanding this pattern helps explain why declarations of victory over inflation should be approached cautiously. Ray Dalio has often emphasized the importance of studying historical cycles. Throughout history, nations facing large debt burdens, significant monetary expansion, and geopolitical uncertainty have frequently experienced inflationary pressures. While every era is unique, recurring patterns provide valuable insights. Ignoring those patterns can lead to costly mistakes. The central issue is not whether inflation will rise every single month. The more important question is whether the underlying conditions that generated inflation have truly disappeared. Government debt remains high. Geopolitical risks remain elevated. Housing affordability remains strained. Labor market imbalances continue. Energy markets remain vulnerable to disruption. These factors suggest that inflation risks may persist longer than many people expect. As we move forward, Americans should prepare for a world where inflation remains a significant economic force. The era of extremely low prices and ultra-cheap money may not return anytime soon. Consumers, businesses, and investors must adapt to a new reality shaped by higher costs and greater uncertainty. Those who understand these changes and respond proactively will be better positioned to navigate whatever comes next. The biggest danger is complacency. Inflation often gains momentum when people assume it has been defeated. By the time its effects become obvious again, much of the damage has already occurred. The warning signs are emerging. The question is whether people will recognize them in time. If inflation is indeed returning and if it proves more persistent than before, the economic consequences could reshape financial decisions, investment strategies, and household budgets for years to come. That is why understanding inflation today may be one of the most important financial priorities for every American.